Morning all. We're going to have a look now at a classic game where Capablanca was defeated sensationally by Richard Reti. Now, in the Evolution of Style series, you'll note that on my map I emphasised Nimzovich. I'll put a link to that Evolution of Style series roadmap. But Nimzovich was emphasised, but however, there were other hypermoderns. Most notably, Richard Reti was one of them. Breyer, and also Tartakower. For Breyer, for example, he had the expression after e4, white's game is in its last throes. But Richard Reti had the Reti Opening named after him, Nf3, and it was in way back in the New York 1924 tournament where Richard Reti really succeeded with this opening, and most dramatically he had to face the reigning world champion who had not lost a single game for 8 years. Now, from an ideological perspective, what was it about the hypermoderns like Nimzovich? What were they saying to refine and extend the classical school of chess, which was a kind of reaction to the more swashbuckling, romantic era? Well, in the romantic era, it was a lot about king's safety factors and sacrificing for the initiative. And the classical era started to emphasise longer term positional advantages. But within the classical era, there weren't given many opportunities for different ways of skinning the cat. By the way, not that I ever want to skin a cat, that's just another English expression, okay? Just to make sure, I love cats, I love dogs. But skinning the cat in terms of central control, do we really want to occupy, the centre with pawns? Or can we actually exert influence from a distance with, say, fianchettoed bishops, for example, cutting across the centre, which we might, for example, get in the Nimzo Indian, where, as well as in the Nimzo Indian, black, getting a pin early, later, the influence is exerted, sometimes with black playing b6, so you get this fianchetto cutting across these central squares. Okay, so this idea of the centre of occupation versus control is echoed through many of the hypermodern players leading the school, but it was Reti introducing knight f3, which is very, very interesting actually, because if you think about it, against d4, nowadays a lot of modern players have a huge amount of respect, not just for occupying the centre with d5, but for playing knight f6. So this echoes this idea of influencing the centre with piece pressure. So knight f6 is keeping a flexibility of pawn structure, and this idea of flexibility is a common thing. For example, in IT, things are getting more and more flexible, like you wouldn't hard code pages with HTML, you use CSS. This idea of keeping flexibility, if you play a pawn move in the centre like d5, you are committed to that pawn. It's never going to go backwards. So you might argue as white, why should you play a move like e4 or d4 when actually there might be a viable approach still meeting the criteria of developing pieces and safely castling, and still meeting the criteria of fighting for the centre, but in a slightly different way, not of occupation literally, but a pointer to the centre, control, influence from afar. And so Reti used this concept, this new ideology, and this whole system of not occupying the centre immediately with a pawn, but actually playing knight f3 was played against the mighty Capablanca. So at that time, I think let's read from Wiki. Basically, also, I find this exceptionally fascinating that Reti himself examined the evolution of chess thinking from the time of Morphy through the beginning of the hypermodern school. That's very, very interesting for me, because are those people interested in the evolution of style also the same to have these experimental ideas and questions about, you know, what could you do which is still effective within the current framework, which achieves the same aim, just a different way of skinning, you know, the metaphorical cat. So knight f3, okay. So this guy Reti, you know, he had written about the evolution of style, and he dares to play this against Capablanca. So how did Capablanca react? Now, this isn't, you know, a classic encounter necessarily between, you know, a major exponent of the classical school and a major hypermodern, in terms of the actual game content, but in terms of raising the profile maybe of hypermodern theory, maybe it was important to show that actually, you know, we should respect these experimental guys from Central Europe. They're all apparently from Central Europe as well, by the way. You know, Reti, Nimzovich, Brea and Tartakower. Central European guys, lots of new ideas. It's after the Second World War. And they're challenging the concept of the centre. The other question is, by the way, you might wonder, well, so what? You know, a lot of games in my club are won through king safety, you know, hacking. And that's true as well. And that's where chess was coming from the Romantic school. I don't think we ever, in our evaluation of positions, never factor out king safety, of course. And in my own evolution of my own thinking, you know, when I was 18, I won the Lloyd's National Under 18, and I had this strategy, I remember at the time, an obsession with just trying to get my best resources on squares around the opponent's king, wherever the king landed, just to get, you know, like the queen and rooks, the best resources, not, you know, any type of piece or combination of pieces around the opponent's king. And that gave me some sort of confidence and idea. But the play was very single-minded. And sometimes, like in this game, that idea of, say, you know, getting a queen round, you know, to attack if the king's here, a square around the king would be like h2 or f2. It can be repulsed if your position is not on solid ground. That's a fundamental principle of Steinitz, that really you need to get an advantage. And this is where the centre is of great importance, because the results of this ideological battle, if you can get a better fight in the centre and win the central battle, then perhaps the argument is that facing a hacker, or, you know, anyone who goes for your throat for your king, the attack should be repulsible because the resources should be there. Okay. So Capablanca, he played knight f6 actually, symmetrical, and now we see c4. So this is like an English opening. White's eyeing the d5 square. Okay, so g6 and now b4. So already White has the idea of fianchetting the queen's bishop to cut across the centre to exert influence on these central squares like this. Now, by the way, Capablanca's not like a king hacker. He's a great representative of the classical school about building positional advantages. But it seems in this particular game, he made, you know, token queen gestures pointing around White's king and f3 later, as you'll see. And they were beaten off because White really had won the battle in the centre in this game. So how did this happen? Well, bishop g7, bishop b2. So the bishops eye each other on this diagonal. And now Kappa castled, and now we see g3. So this double fianchetto system, which I think J. Roby Chess has mentioned, where the two bishops are streaking across the centre, and you'll notice the complementary square colours. You know, the light squares on this diagonal and the dark squares on that diagonal. So this kind of, you know, attack from different directions is also kind of a war metaphor as well. And the central, you know, squares of the chessboard are like the hill in a battle, I guess. You know, having the hill you can see in all directions. But the big question, the experimental guys from Central Europe are saying, do we need to occupy the centre with pawns, or can we exert an influence from the sides, for example? So b6, actually, you know, Kappa's fianchetting his bishop as well, and not occupying the centre immediately either. So bishop g2, bishop b7. So maybe he's already kind of suspicious. He hasn't moved his d or e pawns yet. After castle's now d6. Okay. Now with this configuration, he has weakened a few light squares. He could have maybe consider this kind of manoeuvre and get the bishop out to f5 later. Maybe try for e4. That would have been maybe one of the modern plans available, popularised by Fischer, where you play h5 later. You get your knight maybe to get an attack. Maybe with h4, you overprotect e4, but the bishop being here, it's slightly weakened a couple of squares more than usual. b7 and c6 by that b6 move. Okay, d3, and now knight bd7, knight bd2. So completing development. White's position looks kind of nice. It's got opportunities. Okay, it's a like latent tension, and now there's a slight echo of an occupation of the centre with e5. So is that a big deal here? How is that exploitable? How can White hijack the centre because of this occupation? Is it a premature occupation? Well, theoretically, the pawn chain is underminable here and here with maybe d4 or c5. Interesting in this game, White's aiming for d4 and the d file actually. From his play, he actually plays queen c2. So he's vacating d1 now for a rook. He's keeping a lock on black playing e4. He's giving potential maybe for c5 to try and maybe undermine the pawn chain later at d6. These are all possibilities now. So queen c2 is a general purpose, good looking move. After rook e8, now we see an intention kind of revealed here. Rook fd1. Why does the rook go to d1? Isn't d4 kind of locked down at the moment? Isn't it also discouraged to play d4, in fact, because it will be activating the rook on the e file? Well, nevertheless, that seems to be the plan now. Reti is looking to play d4 in the future of this game. After a5 though, he doesn't want to play b5. That will give black a nice square, the c5 square. So he maintains his pawn actually on b4. He plays a3, and with it he doesn't mind like the exchange of rooks here. Okay, now let me just check something. Is there any notes from Wiki which I should have mentioned really already? Well, we can say actually in 1922, by the way, Richard Reti, he published this book called Die Neuen Idee im Spiel, the English translation, Modern Ideas in Chess, published in 1923. So that was the examination of the evolution of chess thinking from Morphy to the hypermodern school. Nimzovich's book came out was in 1925 to 1927 in 5 instalments, which included elements of hypermodernism, but was largely a text on positional chess. Sorry, that's Nimzovich's My System, published between 1925 and 27. Okay, so Richard Reti, he was one of the top players in the world during the 1910s and 20s. So he began actually his career as a commentative, fierce classical player, like even using like the King's Gambit. It's after the end of the First World War his playing style changed radically. Okay, and he's like the second most important hypermodern after Nimzovich in terms of literary contributions. Nimzovich was My System. He made other literary contributions, and it's these really that influence style the most. These literary works. And I have a couple of Reti's books, like Martyrs of the Chessboard, and another one which looks at different players and their styles. Okay, but this victory gave a lot more respect and credence to the hypermoderns, I think, because Nimzovich, he only had a few draws against Kappa and about 5 or 6 losses. Some of those were so positionally crushing. The Karakan game, as I might have mentioned, Nimzovich thought as though Kappa had nicked his book and used all his ideas against him in My System. But anyway, this is a reigning world champion, So what does Kappa do here, which is very interesting in this position? This is kind of novel what he's facing here, this kind of double fianchetto, with white not, committing a pawn on d4, e4. So it's unfamiliar territory, we could argue. An element of improvisation might creep in here from Kappa, and with that, a subtle blunder which might lead to more emphatic major blunders later on down the line. And I think here we see the first subtle blunder, creating a few weaknesses, not really helping the position. But what really constructively is black doing here, when like e4 as a strategic break is kind of locked down by white quite strongly with the queen on c2. Exchanging rooks doesn't seem that effective. In fact, then there'll be the possibility of this rook coming over and invading on a7 or something. There's always the potential of c5 if the knight moves as well. So black's position is a little bit dicey already, but this next move, h6, not really sure it's a great move. It's a kind of waiting move. Okay, it does mean knight g5 might not be effective as a surprise, hitting the bishop with a discovered attack, but h6 is nevertheless a committal pawn weakening move. It can never be retracted. So what does Reti play here? Is Kappa expecting an immediate break in the centre soon with e3 and d4? Well, first we see this move knight f1 actually, and this is like a characteristic move in a few of the Reti games, which I hope to show you, this knight manoeuvre, because it can pounce towards the centre later via e3. So c5, locking down as though white is locked down now totally from the thought of playing d4. Not only is there a rook ready to blast down the e file, but Kappa is saying, no way are you playing d4. This rook's going to be made to look silly on d1. But white is still going to be pairing d4. He plays actually b5 first, and you'll notice now it's much safer that the knight can't use the c5 square. So knight f8, but is the knight heading for a nice square now like this, for example? e3, white is playing for d4. Queen c7. Now Kappa's basically saying, well, if you ever play d4, at least I'm going to, target c4 as well. So surely this is unpalatable for you to do it. It's played nevertheless. d4. We see the queen being attacked now, rather cheekily, with bishop e4. And now we see Kappa opening up first the e file, the semi-open e file, but there's no targets on it now after ed. And now knight fd7. A pin on the d pawn against the queen. So the queen's embarrassed again, has to move delicately again, sidestepping yet another of black's bishops. So queen d2. Here it's offering also c4 now as a temporary pawn sack. And this really radically changes the whole pawn structure of the position and the whole thing about what's going on. In fact, from a closed centre, it's going to a totally open centre within a few moves now, as all of these pawns are about to be eliminated. So cd, bishop takes, Kappa takes on c4. Now we see bishop g7. We see a check protecting b5. Ready for rook takes d6 to regain material, restore material balance. So the centre's been totally cleared up. I mean, it's been blown up, blown to smithereens. Reti has blown the centre to smithereens by playing for this gradual d4 move, which Kappa was trying to lock down, but it was played anyway. Temporarily losing c4, but regaining d6 with this clever little check. After, that fianchetto bishop gave itself up for black's fianchetto bishop, giving the king, a bit of exposure, which was used for a tempo gain to protect b5 in order to regain d6. So here we have, on move 23, material equality with the centre totally blown wide open. Now, let's look. Why would white, in fact, be winning this battle of the centre here in this position? Why on earth would white stand better? Well, white has pressure already on the d file and already on d7. So this knight can't move without losing d7. He can already create a battery on the d file. So he's intensifying pressure on these squares. And with access to the d-file, you know, the rooks can go in all directions from these outpost squares as well. So this d-file is a very important line to try and occupy and have better quality pieces on. That's the first aspect of the centre here. The second aspect is not only better quality rooks because of that d-file, but arguably the knights are better quality as well. So how are the knights better quality? Well, let's see the knights as I uncolour these squares. This knight, as I mentioned before, is ready to go to e3. This one is already sitting on 2 key squares. So there's a knight on f3, but it can be eliminated at any time, maybe. But then we would have weak light squares in black's position if bishop takes f3 was played. What else is there? Not much else. The queen, though, the queen is sitting on a very nice and useful diagonal here, whilst the black queen cannot find a particularly safe haven. And in fact, if black is forced into artificial moves with the queen, like going to h5, as we're about to witness, then the position is not too pleasant for black. So queen c5, okay, attacking the rook, keeping an eye on b5, and also maybe queen h5 to maybe provide a temporary, you know, immediate threat on an f3. Rook ad1, putting more pressure on d7. And now how is poor Kappa simply defending against this? Is hard, because he can't play knight f6 because of that horrible queen on the diagonal cutting right across that open centre. So is there something in this magical that white actually, because of this greater central control, because of the Reti opening being played, the hypermodern idea is really having a practical impact on the quality of pieces here and the level of artificial moves that Capablanca is forced into playing in this game. I'm sure we have not seen many Capablanca games where he plays this kind of move now, in this kind of position, rook a7. It looks a bit sickly. Black's knights look a bit sickly and frozen. He can't move this one. You can't move that one to f6. You can only retreat. That would be pathetic. These light squares are also highlighted as potential weaknesses. So it looks sickly, and knight e3 is now coming in, which carries with it certain ideas that maybe, you know, knight g4 might be threatening, attacking h6, or maybe threatening rook d7, and knight f6 winning material. So knight g4 is not just hitting d5, but also g4. d5 then queen d6 would seem to be possible anyway. So g4, but you know, Kappa doesn't want to play a move like h5 surely. He does interrupt knight g4 and also creates his own threat now. But it seems a bit of an artificial move which we wouldn't be used to seeing in Capablanca's games, especially with the rooks of lower quality than usual, just sitting passively, the knight sitting passively, and now the queen is forced into this artificial move, simply threatening f3. And in fact here, with engine analysis, there was a knockout blow in this position which was missed. And I wonder actually, just for those interested in the technical accuracies of the positions, if I gave you 20 seconds, do you see a knockout blow for white here? So 20 seconds starting from now. Okay, Reti didn't play this. This would have been sensational as well. But rook 1d5. So the queen hasn't got too many options here. g5 looks actually fairly unpalatable. And I think the next move, g4, would have been played anyway. But bishop takes d5, g4. The queen basically cannot return back to the c5 square. So this would be in effect trapping Kappa's queen and making use of that central d-file. As I said, control of the d-file, you know, is more theoretical if it can't be used for lateral attacks. When it can be used for lateral attacks, any of these rook infiltrations on d5 or d6, so we've got lateral attacks. we've got potential for winning material, defending attacks, or for attacking the opponent's king. This is why the idea of, you know, us all thinking just about the, you know, checkmate and the king is the final thing, I think we've got to also factor in the centre, because the centre, as I mentioned before, the pieces become magical. You know, knights become magical, rooks become magical. They strike in all directions. This vividly demonstrates white winning on the spot here. You know, with rook d5, because it's trapping the queen. But actually in the game, okay, knight d4 was played. Still a very, very pleasant position for white, with massive control on that d file, and the resulting lateral attacking possibilities that implies. But the knight's heading potentially for c6. Black, if he's losing that light square bishop, his light squares are going to be logically weaker now. So bishop takes g2, king g2. Kappa forced into another ugly artificial move, seemingly a bit pointless except some tactical considerations, just pinning the knight. It's evicted again. That's the thing with these artificial moves. They're easy to repulse quite often. So knight c4, queen's going to c5 now, and now knight c6, attacking the rook, forcing that to be on a miserable square, not worrying about this knight on c4 being attacked. So the rook goes to c7, and now again another central attacking move, lovely point, knight e3, but both of white's knights are really hitting out in the centre, you know, very strongly. Central control is wonderful here. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. The knights for the rooks, and even the queen on that lovely sensitive diagonal, which has been further weakened by Capablanca's h6 earlier. So white's possession, rather not possession, control, not occupation, but control, influence, is definitely another way of skinning the cat here. And after knight e5, we see the lateral pressure effects just winning immediately. Rook 1 d5. Winning material. What could Capablanca have played here? Let's stick it on an engine. Is the position really as bad as I'm painting it to be? Well, actually, even though white is not technically material up yet, this has given us 1.68, this position. So let's throw in a token move to see what the threat is. If king h7, rook 1 d5 is a threat, because it's actually winning the queen again on c5. So actually it seems, you know, with this knight c6, the queen's escape route back has been locked out. So the queen is actually being trapped here after knight e3. So if Kappa is actually forced to play rook e3, giving up the exchange, that's not particularly good. But what happens after this exchange sack? Well, here apparently a good move is just queen d2, not only attacking the queen but d7. Now let's assume check, king g1. Now in this position with a lot of pressure on d7, let's assume knight e5, knight e5. Now here rook takes b6, so white will just be the exchange up really. Not much compensation for black, for poor Kappa. There'll be a passed pawn now on the way. And as long as white doesn't suffer being swindled here, this looks like all over. And in fact, rook e8 carries on the attack against the black king. So Capablanca suffered a miserable defeat. Everyone apparently was in shock, not just Kappa and Reti, but loads of people stopped their games. Doesn't matter if it was their turn or not. They came, they heard the news, the world champion had just been defeated. Everyone stopped and had a look, and everyone was just speechless, I imagine. But the representation of how to attack the centre here is in this game example. Now, I did a chess-based lecture on this game and a few others of Reti, but I don't want to make this video absolutely huge, but I want to fully demonstrate the knight f3 idea, because I think it's an important conception of the centre within our evolution of chess style, how the centre is treated or was treated, and how this new idea of influencing the centre rather than occupation was effective or not on a practical level. So comments and questions welcome on this video, and I'll do some Reti games in future videos soon. Thanks very much. Let's actually, before I leave for this video, let's do a quick overview and summary now. So knight f3, hypermodern Reti opening, influencing central control from the two bishops, both being fianchettoed, which is a strategy actually Kasparov once used in a must-win round in a World Championship match against Karpov. He resorted to a double fianchetto system. Here, White is aiming for d-file pressure in particular once he blasts the position open with d4. So this d4 idea is in different openings as well. Like the Roy Lopez, White gradually building up c3 and d4. But here, White really does get loads and loads of pressure on the d-file at the cost of a temporary pawn sack on c4, which he regains. And the rooks are now awkward. Black's forced into these artificial looking moves. And it seems that the influence on the centre from White is now huge. Not only that, technically, Black's queen is now trapped and surrounded. So winning material forcibly now in this position because of this huge threat of rook 1 to d5. The queen cannot retreat on the diagonal, cannot retreat backwards, cannot go anywhere. So basically Kappa just gave up really on the position with this move, allowing rook 1 to d5. It's winning the knight. By the way, let's just examine this why this is exactly winning, just to make absolutely sure. So say, well, the queen, unless the queen's been given up, actually knight c4 might have been, I don't know, an idea floating around. Rook takes c5, knight takes b2, and now here there are a couple moves at least which completely win for White. Now apparently, in this position, knight d5 is a crushing move. Let's say just takes, knight takes. Here, for example, there'll be knight e7 check. And if the rook moves somewhere, knight takes a5, just a winning position quite easily. So that would be a crushing idea. So it's possible, actually. I should have mentioned this. The idea actually is to play knight c4 here. If knight c4, queen c4, and everything's okay. So the continuation here, rook takes c5, knight takes b2. There's another way of winning this position, just with a rook retreat. Maybe this is a bit simpler. So if the knight's kind of trapped, if it goes to d3, it's taken. If it goes to a4, then knight d5 again. So threatening not only the rook, but also knight f6. This looks to be the simpler method of winning the position, actually, just winning material here. So if knight e6, well, I imagine that knight f6 looks pretty strong here, although it's not coming up for some reason. That's pretty good as well. That's pretty simple. So the simple, straightforward win basically after knight e5. Knight c4 is just to take the queen and just attack the rook with rook c2. Sorry, attack the knight, and that's kind of stranded. So maybe that's why in fact Capablanca resigned. It wasn't. It maybe had this idea of knight c4, but the final position with all the coloured arrows demonstrates White totally and utterly controls all the central squares. So the Reti system had really worked. Thanks very much.